My name is Diana Colleen, and I'm a Civic Engagement Program Officer with the California Community Foundation. Official welcome to our Advocacy and Lobbying training. This training is hosted by the California Community Foundation, Weingart Foundation, and the Alliance for Justice. We hope you are keeping safe and getting ready for the upcoming elections. This year, one of our goals is to bring you all, our partners, resources and tools so that your organization is prepared to engage both in the June primary, November general. And our training today, like I said, is an advocacy and training. This is one of two trainings. The next one is March 17, and we'll share the link on the chat so you can register for that one. That one will be on nonpartisan advocacy in an election year. So we hope to see you there too. I will stop there and introduce you all to our speakers for the day that will do welcome remarks. The first one is V. Nguyen, who represents the Weingart Foundation, and followed by Efrain Escobedo with the California Community Foundation. So we'll hear welcome remarks by them and then hand it over to our experts at Alliance for Justice. So V.
Thank you so much, Diana, and just so grateful to be here with you all. Yeah, V. Nguyen with the Weingart Foundation. I want to, it's so nice to see all your names, the names of your organizations in the chat, and just hope everybody is doing as well as can be. I miss you all. I haven't seen folks in person nearly enough, but it's great to see you here. Wanted to extend a deep thanks to our partners at the California Community Foundation and Alliance for Justice for co-sponsoring and putting on this this training today. As Diana mentioned, it's a big civic engagement year. There's a lot of exciting work going on, and we at the Weingart Foundation just continue to encourage folks, and we ourselves try to be as supportive as possible where we can, but to continue to learn about and pursue advocacy. There, as you will hear today, there is so much that nonprofits can do in this space that is critically important, and critically important to the kind of power building and systems change that we all seek to achieve. Really briefly, I'll share as well some of Weingart's activities this year, in addition to providing the unrestricted operating support that's so important, I know, to you all as you continue to do your work and take on leadership. We're also working through the Committee for Greater LA, and CCF is also a partner in this as well, of course, to partner with Southern California Public Radio and other ethnic media partners as well, to really provide a lot of voter and civic education, nonpartisan candidate debates as well, and really get the information out to our communities and uplift the issues that our communities care about in this election cycle. So just wanted to provide those brief remarks of welcome. I hope that, you know, whether you all are already engaged in advocacy and looking to kind of get a refresher today, or whether you all are kind of newer to this space and looking to see what's possible, I know that this this training with Alliance for Justice will be fruitful, and just want to continue to share that the Weingart Foundation supports these efforts and will continue to do so. With that, do I turn it back over to you, Diana, or to my wonderful colleague, Efrain?
We can do Efrain. Thanks, V.
Great. Good morning, all. And just to echo V, it's so great to at least be able to share some space virtually. So very happy to be with you all here today, and for continuing to work so closely with Weingart Foundation, and more importantly, many of you on the call. But just special gratitude for the ongoing leadership and support that Alliance for Justice provides many of us. I mean, like many of you, CCF and our partners at Weingart constantly turn to Nona and the team at AFJ for guidance, for brainstorming conversations about what else could we be doing to really advance advocacy and the important policy changes that we all need to see to build a stronger and more resilient LA and California as well. And to echo V as well, such an important year this year, but just the past 2 years, right, have been so critical. And it's trainings like this that are always great, to hear about what partners are doing, to also get feedback about work that they hope to be advancing as well. But I just have to say, I mean, part of us working collectively and joining with each other in trainings like this is also what we've learned from a lot of great friends in the movement, right? Which is it's not enough for us to just do great work in our communities. It's not enough for us to just think about great policy ideas and write up great policy. It really takes us being able to utilize every tool in our toolbox as organizations to really bring the voices and interests of the most effective directly to power and to inform the changes that we want to see. And we do that through advocacy. And it's these trainings and your leadership that help ensure that we can utilize the assets we have, not just the human assets, but our organizations as vehicles for amplifying and really bringing the voices of the more effective communities to drive the changes that we want to see in our community. So with that, I just want to express our gratitude and say that at CCF, we continue to partner with you all to think of ways that we could advance greater advocacy, build power in our communities, and are looking forward to not just 2022, but the years ahead as we continue to navigate the pandemic and the new world we're all trying to build together. So thank you for the space to express some of those thoughts and gratitude. And thank you again for our partners at AFJ for bringing a lot of this great knowledge into the space and for our collective learning. Jan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Efrain. Thank you, V. And we'll get to the good stuff. So I'll hand it over to Quinn at Alliance for Justice.
Hold on, Zoom is telling me I'm muted, but I'm not muted. So, okay, thanks for the feedback. I think Efrain took the first 15 minutes of our presentation, so I think we can skip over some of this stuff, but we'll cover it. It's great to be here. My name is Quinn too, and I am Southern California Counsel at Alliance for Justice in the Boulder Advocacy Program. You will hear a lot from me today because I'll be the lead trainer, but I would like to invite Nona to introduce ourselves while I set up and prepare the rest of the presentation.
Good morning, folks. My name is Nona Randois. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the California Director for Alliance for Justice and our Boulder Advocacy Program. And it's so nice to see so many folks who I know are engaged in really great work, really important work, and work that we want to be able to support and take it to the next level of becoming policy change, becoming systems change, becoming new laws. And so my role today will mainly be in the Q&A box because I know there's a lot of us here. And so I'm going to be typing as fast as I can in the Q&A box and answering those questions there while Quinn leads the presentation. So it's nice to be here. Thank you. Thank you, Efrain, for all the and V for all the nice things that you said about us. And it's really our honor to support the field and all the really fundamental work that everybody on this call today is doing. So it's great to be here.
Yes, definitely a privilege for both Nona and I to do so. Just a couple of housekeeping before we launch into the training itself. We will be sending out a copy of the slides that you'll be seeing. All of the links will be clickable, so you should be able to access that. And we will send out a link to the recording of today's session. And next month, Nona will lead the session on what nonprofits can do during an election cycle. So I will play the reverse role. But Also, the last thing before I forget is at the end of the training, Nona will pop in a link to a very, very brief survey that we would appreciate if you'll fill out. It helps us make this training a lot better for you. So as we go through the training, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and I will pause at some points during the training as well to answer some of the questions out loud. So, all right. Most of you are probably familiar with Alliance for Justice, but if you're not, we are a 501c3 organization ourselves. We're based in DC, or headquartered in DC, I should say, but Nona and I are based in Southern California, and we have a new colleague who has joined us from Northern California as well. So you can reach us for free technical assistance at 866-MP-LOBBY or email us at advocacy@afj.org. We have this hotline available to you in case you have questions that come up after today's training, or 3 months down the road, you have something and you're not clear what exactly it was that we talked about. Feel free to reach out to us there. And we also offer technical assistance in Spanish. I've shared that information with you. We will share some of our resources and podcast episodes on Boulder Advocacy, but we'll share that in a follow-up email as well. And of course, we're on social media, so stay in touch with us to find out what we do. Okay. Today's session, we're really going to cover a few things that will help you understand what the nonprofit organization's rights and abilities are according to IRS rules. I think Efrain's already covered the importance of advocacy, and I love it that there's so many people who are really gung-ho and doing this, inspired to do so. We'll briefly touch upon that. And we'll spend the bulk of the time on IRS lobbying definitions. There were a lot of organizations as I was looking through the list. So some of you will probably fall under the insubstantial part tests. Some of you have already made the election for the 501H expenditure tests. We'll talk about what those two things mean and what you can do if you're interested in following up with us on that. We'll spend some time with definitions of direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying, and then wrap up with an overview of lobbying exceptions. So let's start with a pretty foundational slide that we like to orient everybody with. So we're going to start talking about 501c3s, but before I do that, I'm really curious if you can put in chat if you know whether you're from a C3 organization or a C4 or some other type of organization, or you don't know at all, and that's okay too. We can certainly help you figure that out. I'm seeing a lot of C3s. If you know, oh, fiscally sponsored, okay. If you know that you're from a private foundation or a public foundation, certainly you can include that as well. I'm seeing a lot of C3s, just as I suspected based on the registration list. Okay, we're going to cover rules for 501c3 public charities. If you are from a private foundation, and there are some private foundations on here, these rules don't really apply to you. You have slightly different rules, so talk to us about that separately. But we're going to cover the rules for C3 public charities. I mentioned Alliance for Justice is one. Chirla is an example of a C3. Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, which I only learned about as I was preparing for this session. Such a cool organization. You're a C3, and a whole bunch of you on chat are also C3s. So that means from a tax treatment perspective, you're a tax exempt organization. You don't pay income tax, and you also get to have tax deductible contributions. So when donors write a check to you, they can deduct that from their taxes. And oh, thanks for letting me know that ROC is also a C4. Yeah, we'll get to that in a bit too. So because of that superpower to tell donors that they can deduct their contributions, the IRS has limited what lobbying you can do as a 501c3 public charity. As a side note, private foundations, you are basically not allowed to lobby because when you do, the excise tax on it is pretty cost prohibitive. So C3 public charities, you can lobby, but it's limited. And we're going to spend a lot of today's session talking about that and why that is. And then next month, we will talk about what it means to not support or oppose candidates for public office. Okay. The next category of organizations to look at for comparison are 501c4s. Those were also called social welfare organization. And as somebody put in chat, ROC has a C4. Alliance for Justice also has a C4, and so does CHIRLA. It's called CHIRLA Action Fund, right? C5s are your labor unions, and C6s are your trade associations. These organizations are categorized in this same column because they're treated pretty much the same from an IRS perspective. So they are also tax exempt, but because they don't get to have tax deductions for their donors, their lobbying activity is unlimited. That's why it's in a green box. And this group of organizations can also do some kind of endorsement of candidates. There's a lot more rules to follow, and we will definitely talk about some of that next session as well, but just a preview for you. And then lastly, for comparison, are 527s or political organizations. Sometimes you hear them referred to as PACs. They include Emily's List and NEA funds. They're also tax exempt organizations, but when they get in lobbying, they may be taxed on it. So they don't really do that. They exist mainly to get people or a slate of people elected into office. So this chart will really help you understand why sometimes an organization says, oh yeah, we can totally do that. And sometimes they say, no, we're not allowed to do that. Hopefully this gives you that understanding. Are there any questions at this point? All right, so I'm going to fly.
We don't have anything in the Q&A. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no worries. Thanks. Yes, the slides will be shared with everybody after the end of the session. And please put your questions in Q&A if you have anything that comes up. The importance of advocacy. Efrain and V gave you some reasons for why, advocacy is important to them. Here's a reason why it's important to us at Alliance for Justice. We really believe that it's a tool to achieve policy and community change. So this was a coalition of nonprofit organizations supporting Racial Justice Act for All, right? And I just like to remind you, none of us can do this alone. So we need everybody's hands and heart and effort in this endeavor. Okay, so here are not an exhaustive list of the types of advocacy that are out there. And we have partisan political activity in red because you'll learn from next session that's not allowed for 501c3 organizations. We're going to spend a lot of our time talking about lobbying, which is in yellow, which to me means proceed with caution. But you can see that there are lots of advocacy efforts in green, like organizing or public education or putting together conferences and doing research that don't count as lobbying, but are advocacy efforts that can also be very influential as well. So we just wanted to show you a visual representation of how lobbying fits in the bigger advocacy picture. And briefly, here's a working definition of lobbying that we will use. We're talking about trying to influence legislation, including ballot measures, so that we have something to start from. So we get a lot of questions about how much lobbying can nonprofits do? And the perennial answer that all attorneys love to give their clients is it really depends. It depends in this case on whether or not your organization has made an election. So if you have not, you're going to be under the insubstantial part test. And if you've made the election, you may be under the 501H expenditure test. So let's get right to it and talk about what is the insubstantial part test. So this is the default test for all 501c3 organizations. If you do nothing else but form your organization, this is the way that you will measure your lobbying and report it to the IRS. There are really no clear definitions of what lobbying is, and we have gathered from advice letters from the IRS that an insubstantial amount is about 3 to 5% of an organization's activities. And because it's activities-based, it's going to be both paid and unpaid activities. So organizations that rely on volunteer efforts will have to count those in their 3 to 5%. So that's an insubstantial part test. It's rather unsatisfying as a way to explain and describe how to measure lobbying under this test. The good news is that we have a second option for most of us, which is the 501H expenditure test. So I say most of us because this is not available to houses of worship, and it may not make sense for some public charities that have over $17 million in exempt expenditure. But outside of that, this is something that is worth taking a hard look at. So the 501H expenditure involves making a one-time filing with the IRS, and Form 5768 is about the world's easiest form. It's half a page, and you submit it to the IRS, and that's the signal to the IRS that your C3 public charity would like to measure your lobbying under this test. There are clear definitions of lobbying, which we will get to later on in this training. And you also have a dollar-based formula to calculate your lobbying limits. So you can project what your lobbying limit is going to be for the year and kind of track it as you go through and figure out if you're on track or if you have more room one way or another. And because it's a dollar-based formula, only spending counts. So the volunteer efforts that you would have had to account for under the insubstantial part test, you don't count under the 501H expenditure. So we really think this is a good election for a lot of 501c3 public charities. And if you have questions about figuring this out or whether or not this makes sense for your organization, I really invite you to contact us on our technical assistance hotline or contact me or Nona separately, and we'll happily walk you through whether or not this makes sense for your organization. This is just an illustration of what your lobbying limits could look like under the 501H. And this is based on an organization that has an annual exempt expenditure of $250,000. So you can see that lobbying is a good portion of the budget. And there's a formula that we have, a lobbying calculator that we're happy to share with you. If you plug in 250, you'll get that you can spend an overall lobbying limit of 50,000. And out of that 50,000, 12,500 of that can be spent on grassroots lobbying. And this is more just for illustration. If you'd like to get deeper into this, we can certainly spend some time on that. So for the majority of you, what you want to know is, why do we care about this? We care about this because all 501c3 public charities that lobby have to report it to the IRS, and you do so on your Form 990. So if you're having somebody in your office ask you about how many hours or how much did you spend on lobbying activities, they're trying to put together this report. So you answer in this question whether or not your organization has lobbied, and if you say yes, then you're directed to attach Schedule C. And Schedule C is where you would report lobbying efforts, whether you're under the default test or under the 501H expenditure tests. Okay, that was a lot of words. So I'll pause for any questions or any other comments that people have.
Well, my dog is crying, but I don't think that that has anything to do with having to report lobbying. So I have answered one question in the chat, and I'm not seeing any more, but please feel free to drop those questions. Sorry, not the chat. Put your questions in the Q&A box. That will make it easier for me to answer them. So Alfonso has just put something in the chat, but in the future, let's try to keep them in the Q&A box. There is a question, I think. So that's
worries,
okay, Alfonso. We're gonna get to Alfonso's question for sure. So I'll raise up Denise's question in the Q&A box for you to answer right now. She says, is this test formula-based? If so, what is the formula?
Yes.
And Brady has a similar question. It's about, how do we know if the 501H test or the insubstantial test is right for us?
We love answering that question at Alliance for Justice. So we can certainly get into specifics about your individual organization's questions offline, but generally we have found that if your organization spends less than $17 million in exempt expenditure, and that's quite a big number, that the 501H expenditure tests makes sense for you. And we'd love to get into more details for your specific organization. It is a formula. I am terrible at formula, so I have not memorized it. I just go to our handy dandy calculator, which we will also send out to you after this. And I put in the numbers, and then it tells me what the overall lobbying limit is and what the grassroots lobbying limit is. But yes, there is a formula that you could sit and figure out what it is as well. So we'll share that post-training. And thank you, Alfonso. You've kind of set us up for our next part, which is to talk about what does direct lobbying mean under the 501H expenditure tests, and what about grassroots lobbying, since we keep talking about these terms. So let's get into it. So direct lobbying involves a communication to a legislator or a government official, and you're expressing a view about specific legislation. So by the end of this session, or this part of the training, you'll hopefully understand why this LA City Council communication counts as direct lobbying under 501H. But let's look at each part individually. So communication is fairly straightforward. It's however you communicate, whether you do that directly in person or virtually, it's communication. Legislators. Legislators include all levels of government. So the federal government, the state, the county, and the cities, and also tribal councils. So any kind of legislators And I put and their staff on there because it depends on if you're having communications with their staff about, logistics, like when to set up the next meeting, that's certainly not going to count as lobbying. But if you're having communications with a policy chief of staff and you're talking about a bill and you're saying, oh, we really think this bill is terrible for our community, or we really think it's great for our community, you are meeting the definition of direct lobbying at that point. So it depends on what you're talking to the staff about. And then just the special legislator rules in the context of ballot measure, when the public is the one who's going to be voting on it, they become the legislators. So if you're talking to and putting out messages about how we should all have supported schools and communities first, that would have been a direct lobbying communication under 501H. And then the IRS has said these groups of people are not legislators. So if you're working with the sheriff or the Planning and Zoning Commission or housing authorities or school boards, and you want them to do something, that's not lobbying at that point. So I see Nona's put on the lobbying calculator. Awesome. Maybe that'll help whoever has that question. So I see the question about school board members. Yes, school board members are not legislator under 501H. And then specific legislation. So what is specific legislation? It's really easy when it has SB 56 or AB 73, right? When it has a bill number or it has a bill name, like in this case, the omnibus. That's specific legislation. You can also have specific legislation when you're talking about a position that requires nomination and confirmation. So I'm hoping to be able to update this slide very soon with an exciting nominee from President Biden. But until then, we'll satisfy ourselves with this. So if there's a position that requires a nomination and confirmation process, and you want to express your preference as a C3 with your senator, that would be specific legislation. It can also be that you want specific spend in a budget, or you want the budget allocated a certain way, whether it's the federal budget or the state budget or the local budget. You're talking about specific legislation. You're also talking about specific legislation if you have an idea on how to address a problem. So you present an idea of a solution to a problem, that can be specific legislation as well. Okay, IRS has made exemptions for these. So when you're working on regulations and executive orders, that's not specific legislation. Neither is asking for existing laws to be enforced or being involved in litigation. And litigation really makes sense to me because that happens in a different branch of government altogether. That's not legislative. So, but if your organization wanted to work, especially, at the beginning of the pandemic, when we saw a flurry of executive orders from the state governors, or at the beginning of administration, when lots of executive orders were signed, if you weighed in on those, that's not legislation. So that wouldn't have counted as lobbying. Okay, I see more questions popping up. Nona, are you good, or should we pause and answer some of them out loud?
I think one of the ones that I just wanted to highlight, and this goes, actually, I'll come back to the end of some like overall considerations. So I think one of the things, there's a number of questions still about how do you define who's a legislator and who's not? I think this would be a good one. Is the test based on whether they're elected or appointed, or are there other considerations? And I have kind of put a little teaser in a question that I answered, that It's not so much whether the person you're talking to is considered a legislator, but whether the policy that you are working to support or oppose or influence is considered legislative. So I think just, I know you're kind of getting into that, and I think there's a lot of questions around that.
Yeah, and hopefully, as we work through some examples that can also help, but there are people who you may think of as legislators, but the IRS has said aren't, right? So probably this is where the question is stemming from. If there are people, one way to look at it is, are they voting on something? Yeah, forget whether or not they're elected or appointed, but do they
It's
have
really not just about whether they're voting either. But sorry, I just wanted to clarify that. So the question of what's legislative is defined as just only being city council, county board of supervisors, tribal councils, state legislature, and Congress. So yeah, that slide right there. So those are the legislatures, and the policies that those folks vote on are legislation. So school boards vote on stuff, and that's not legislation. That just because that's the way that the IRS defines it. But when these bodies that are showing on the screen right now, Congress, state leg, county board of soups, when they vote on something, that's legislation. City council, when they vote on something, that's legislation. Same with tribal councils, international legislatures, in case any of you are doing that. That's how you think about what's legislation. Sorry, I'll turn it back over to Quinn.
No worries.
Type in some answers here.
It helps to have a different perspective, sometimes just explain it too. So no, I'm very glad for that. And I hope that clarified questions for people. So we're going to now get your involvement and ask you if you think this is lobbying or not. So your C3 organization, your public charity, is asked to write a letter urging California legislators to pass AB 854 and keep families home, or keep families in homes. So do people think this is lobbying or not lobbying? You can put it in the chat. Do you have questions before you can make a decision? Although lots of people have already made their decisions. So the question you should look at when you're considering this is, do you have a communication with a legislator about a specific piece of legislation, right? So as the majority have said, and I agree, this is direct lobbying, right? You have the elements of a communication to a legislator about AB 854. So just as a reminder, this is totally legal for C3 public charities to do lobby. You can do it with unrestricted funds and track it and report it. Okay, how about this example where your C3 is retweeting this? By the way, I know this bill has already passed, but I'm using it for illustrative purposes. So pretend the bill hasn't passed yet, and you are retweeting this post from NARAL that says, Governor Gavin Newsom, you have the opportunity to reinforce that California truly is a reproductive freedom state by signing this bill. Lobbying? Maybe? Yeah? No? Yes, I agree that this is also going to be direct lobbying, right? Because you're asking the governor to pass a bill by signing it. If this had been, thank you, Governor Newsom, for signing this bill into law, that would have been not lobbying, because you're not going to be meeting the definitions of direct lobbying. There's a quick question that I see here, and one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight this. Yes, the IRS considers a retweet or a repost on social media to be the same as if you sat down and wrote the entire content in there yourself. So if you're retweeting something, especially as a C3, it behooves you to understand where all of the links lead to, or the hashtag, or the what it's doing. And the corollary question is, how much do you spend on retweeting time-wise? Of course, it probably would take you like 2 seconds to retweet this if all you did was just retweeted it, or if you added a short message to it, it's still not going to take a long time. So we suggest that you come up with a reasonable way to measure that, whether you count all of your social media time once a week and you do it all on Friday morning at 9 a.m. and you spend 30 minutes doing it, or you do it throughout the week and you make sure that it adds up to an hour of your time and you report it that way. That would be the way to track for lobbying reporting purposes. How about this example? And this comes from the People's City Council, and it's a map of the coronavirus cases in the neighborhood. And your C3 just wants to educate your legislators about the effects of pollution on the health of your community, and it's linked to coronavirus infection rates. And it has a link to the LA Times story here. We have a lot of really, really good people on this call who understand these rules. Yeah, this wouldn't be considered lobbying, right? You're not trying to convince the legislator to vote on a specific piece of legislation a certain way. So it's not lobbying. What about this one? If you posted this on your C3 social media account and it's hashtag health for all, and you're saying Newsom just included a whole bunch of money in his proposed budget for coverage for 26 to 49 years old. Yeah, I'm curious for all those who are putting not lobbying, why you say that. I'm not saying that it's wrong, but this would be nice to have some for people who may be new to this concept or maybe thinking about it for the first time. Yeah, it's education, it's an update, right? It's not directed at Newsom. Yeah, so you go back to your element. Do you have a communication? Yes. Is it directed to a legislator? No, this is just really news telling us what's happening, what he's doing. And is there a view about a specific piece of legislation? Arguably, you're talking about the budget and you're saying what's happening, but there isn't specific ask of, the governor should spend 12% of the budget on people ages 26 to 49. So yeah, this would not be lobbying. And exactly as some have said in chat, this is just sharing and updating. So those are some examples of direct lobbying. We'll move on to grassroots lobbying. And the good news is the definition of grassroots lobbying is similar to direct lobbying. You still have a communication. Instead of to a legislator, this time you're directing your communication to the general public. You're still expressing a view about a specific legislation, and you have an added thing of this call to action. So here it's tell the Senate in this example, right? You're telling the Senate to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So this would be an example of grassroots lobbying. There are only 4 things that count as calls to action. So they include telling someone to contact a legislator, like tell the Senate or tell your representative. Providing the legislator's contact info. So if you put their social media handle or their phone number or address on there. If you're providing a way to communicate with the legislators, that can be a call to action. And lastly, identifying legislators who are undecided or opposed to your view on the legislation. So here is an example of a sign-on letter from Immigrants RLLA. Do people think that this is IRS lobbying? And if so, grassroots, direct, or you don't know and you need more questions? So the sign-on letter, I hope you can read it, but I'll read some of it out loud. By completing this form, I, as a representative of my organization, agree to the letter that addresses the members of the LA Board of Supervisors. And I'm asking for the following things: that 35%, that the Board of Supervisors invests 35% of the $1.9 billion it will receive from ARP funding to meet the needs of its immigrant population, regardless of immigration status. So those are the highlighted parts that I read out. Lobbying, not lobbying, questions. Yes, lobbying. Okay, and I see
We
no
have some
grassroots
different
lobbying.
perspectives.
Yes. Yeah, definitely different perspectives here. People want to share why you think yes or no, or if you have questions. Okay, let's go through this. Do we have a communication? Yes, we have a letter, right? Is it directed to the public? Yes, this is on, a link that you can find from Immigrants RLA's website. Is there expression of a view about specific legislation? Yeah, in this case, there's this pretty specific ask that the board invests 35% of the $1.9 billion to immigrants, right? And do you have a call to action? So this letter is going to be sent to the LA Board of Supervisors. Yeah, so we have grassroots lobbying here. And another reminder, it's totally legal for C3 public charities to do. You can do grassroots lobbying. Just track it and report it. Okay, how about this example here? This is a graphic that has AB 901, and it talks about eliminating driver's license suspension for failure to appear and reduces fines. And it says Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez and Speaker Anthony Rendon can save this bill. Ask them to support AB 907. Yeah, lots of consensus, right? Grassroots lobbying. Okay, what if I took off the bottom part and just kept the top part about AB 907? Now, do I still have lobbying? Right. This is now not a lobbying piece, and it can be a PSA. It can be, you're just putting your point of view out there, but you're not asking the public to do anything about it. Now, if you printed out this flyer or you sent this graphic to, Speaker Rendon, would you have lobbying at that point, or would it still be an informative piece? Ah, okay. So if I took this graphic and emailed it to the speaker, I have a communication, legislator, and I'm expressing a view about specific legislation. So what do I have? Direct lobbying at that point. Yeah.
I wanted to make one other point about this example because this really highlights the importance of the 501H election. These call to action rules only apply to groups who are using the 501H election, the expenditure test. So the groups who've taken that step to tell the IRS that that's how they want to measure their and report their lobbying, get to use this kind of message and know that it doesn't count as lobbying. Whereas for those of you who are still under the default test, the insubstantial part test, you still have to report your lobbying, and this would probably count because there's no requirement for a call to action for groups who are under that insubstantial part test. So these really nice kind of clear lines about what counts as grassroots lobbying and doesn't are not applicable to folks who are under the default test. For the default test, the question is just, are you trying to influence legislation? And, you know, with a message like this, it might seem that you're trying to influence legislation. So it's both not as clear, and it includes a lot more kinds of public communications.
That would be considered lobbying under the default test. So this is another good place to pause for questions. Do we have questions?
Yeah, we do. So one question was, is sharing information about upcoming hearings or meetings where legislation will be discussed considered lobbying? So what if you're giving people information about what's being proposed and how to submit comments, but not taking a direct stance on the proposed legislation?
Yeah, that's a good one, because preparation for lobbying counts as lobbying. If you're sharing this information to prepare for a lobbying effort, and you want people to show up and, you know, talk to their legislators or whatnot, it can be. If you're just sharing information like tonight at 7, this is happening at the school board, not the school board, that would be a bad example. This morning at 10 a.m., the California Senate is going to vote on this. You know, that may count as lobbying. What do you have to add,
The question is really, the question is really, are you expressing a view? Because if you think about the definitions that Quinn's been talking about, you know, this isn't direct lobbying because we're not communicating or with a government official, and we're not preparing to communicate with a government official, but so it's not direct lobbying. We are communicating with the general public or members of the public who are not government officials. So then the question is, are we expressing a view about specific legislation? Because certainly this would be considered either trying to influence or a call to action. So the question for me, like I said, are you expressing a view? And that is broader than just saying, you know, but tell them to vote yes or tell them to vote no on this proposal. It's really anything where the general public or the legislature would understand that a certain legislation is good or bad, right? That they would understand basically what you want them to say about the proposed legislation, then I would consider that to be direct lobbying. I mean, sorry, I said that wrong. Grassroots lobbying, yes. I would consider that to be grassroots lobbying. If you're telling folks, you know, come out and tell the county board XYZ about, you know, what the, you know, how much ARP funds should be spent on this or that. But if you're, like Quinn said, if you're just saying, you know, county board is voting on A, B, and C today at 10 o'clock, come and, you know, tell them what you think. That probably is not expressing a view.
Yeah, that seems to be more on the informational side of things. So, okay. All right, let's see if there are any other questions to address. Nona?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Did you want me to read some more of the questions here?
Sure. I just don't know which one you're answering
oh,
or which ones you want to flag.
Yeah, so I haven't gotten to flag them all. I'm sorry, but
I made you answer questions and you haven't been able to look at the Q&A box.
Oh no, I am looking at it. There's a lot there and I haven't gotten through all of it.
Got it.
Yeah. So why don't we do this one? What about simply liking a tweet?
Yes. So as with the repost, the IRS considers that if you're reposting, if you're liking something, expressing some kind of, I don't know, agreement with the post, that you've adopted that post. Mind you, there aren't any direct IRS guidance on social media because the IRS is very much behind the times, but we would say that especially if you've taken the 501h election and you have a lot of lobbying limits that you haven't used, you have room in your lobbying, it doesn't hurt to count it as lobbying. And again, how long does it take you to light a tweet? It might be like 2 seconds. So what is the dollar value to that 2 seconds? Probably not a lot. So I would count it. If you're finding that you're on and pushing the limit of your lobbying for the year, certainly reach out to us and we can help you look at what you've counted as lobbying and see if it does still make sense to count all of those. But generally, counting the likes as a lobbying is not going to impact your lobbying limit a lot.
Another question that we have here is around tests other than the IRS test. And I don't know if you have a slide about that or not.
We
or
do.
if you just want me to briefly mention it. Okay, so we'll
we do,
that.
But we won't get into a lot of details. Just as a preview, there are other rules around lobbying. We're just focusing this morning on the IRS rules. One, we didn't want to overwhelm you and have you running away from us and saying this is impossible. We want you to know that this is totally doable and Boulder Advocacy is here to support you. So we're taking it one step at a time. In addition to the IRS rules, though, there are California lobbying disclosure rules that apply in certain situations. We can certainly talk to you about those. There are also, because we live in such a great county, the county has lobbying rules and the city also has lobbying rules. But again, those are just one step at a time. And if you're in a position where you have to report for LA County or LA City, we can certainly walk you through those as well. And the reason why we don't talk about all that is because the IRS rules are global. They apply to every single level of government. So if you're doing any lobbying, you're reporting it to the IRS. But for the state and the local levels, you have to meet certain thresholds in order to even trigger the registration and reporting process. And those are just really registration and reporting. There are no limits to how much you can lobby at the state or the county and city in the same way that the IRS places limits for 501c3 public charities.
We also have fact sheets about those, and we can circulate those as part of our follow-up email. And for anyone who has questions about them, we're available to answer those questions.
I see a question here about unrestricted funds. That goes to
I wanted to get, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No worries. The unrestricted funds goes to the idea that sometimes you'll get grants or funding, especially from like the federal government, that will tell you that you can't use that fund for lobbying. That's the idea behind that. It's not that you can't lobby, you just can't use those monies for lobbying.
Yeah, I was going to say, I will revisit it at the wrap up, because I thought it would be a good way to wrap up the session by reminding folks that everyone can lobby, and it's just important to know when you are, so that A, you can track it and report it appropriately, and B, you can, because there are sources of funds, generally public funds in particular, that can't be used for lobbying. So, you know, the IRS actually doesn't care what money you use for lobbying or not, but, you know, whoever your public funder is, or even in some cases, private funders that may put restrictions on lobbying, they care. And so that's about your relationship with your funder in that situation. One other thing, and then I think, because I don't want to get too far off, I don't know what more you wanted to cover, but I think the only other question that I see right now, although questions are still coming in, that has to do with what is lobbying, was, can you provide an example of proposing a solution to a problem, or an idea to a problem that's considered specific legislation? And I guess one of the example that the IRS uses for this, a simple example, would be saying, hey, you know, LA County should do what, you know, I'm like, which Santa? What, you know, San Francisco is doing about this particular issue, right? And so pointing to something specific that's already a law in another place, you know, California should adopt a system that's similar to what they have in New York, right? That would be an example of saying, hey, there's a problem, here's a solution, and the solution is legislation. And it's pretty specific, right? Because it's something that already exists in another jurisdiction. So, but even if you have kind of a write-up like of something that's, you know, a couple pages long and has some bullet points in it, the IRS would probably consider that specific legislation, especially if you're kind of shopping it. If you're talking to the legislator and you are saying, hey, this is, you know, Schoolhouse Rock, like, I've got an idea and this should be the law. When you're handing them that piece of paper, the IRS probably says that's specific legislation even before it's introduced. So that's kind of a fine point, but I thought I would just.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. You know, you could talk to legislators about problems like we should, you know, have less policing or any number of topic you'd want. But then if you start saying, and here's how we should do that, that starts to lean towards specific legislation. Okay, well, I will move on and cover lobbying exceptions while you handle more questions in the chat or the Q&A box. We're so used to saying questions in the chat, I'm sorry. Okay, overview of lobbying exceptions. These are things that are going to look like lobbying, but the IRS has said they're not lobbying. So they include doing partisan analysis, study, or research, requests for technical assistance, and we'll get into the first two in more details in a little bit, but there's also self-defense. Self-defense doesn't come up a lot, but it's when there's a law that threatens the existence of your organization. Like if somebody were to propose a law that says, let's not have tax deductions for 501c3 public charities, you could certainly talk to and make your points of views known about what that would be and, you know, what a bad idea that is, and that would not count as lobbying. That's self-defense because it threatens the existence of your organization. And then examinations and discussions of broad social, economic, and similar problems. That's not lobbying because you're basically, on a panel or you're having discussions where you're just saying, and we really need racial justice in our state, but you don't really talk about the solution to getting to racial justice. You're just looking at what caused the problem, how we got to this point. That's what those are. Okay, so nonpartisan analysis. These are helpful to organizations who, one, either cannot lobby or are reaching their lobbying limits and need to figure out a different way to advocate. Or third, they have restricted funds that they can't use for lobbying, but you could certainly use it for a nonpartisan analysis. So what it requires is that there be a full and fair discussion of whatever the issue happens to be. So your 1 to 2 pager on a problem and a solution is probably not going to count as full and fair. It should be broadly disseminated. Most organizations will put these analyses on their website, send them to anybody and everybody on their mailing lists. Within this analysis, you may express a view about specific legislation, and you may also have an indirect call to action. So this is an example that came at the beginning of the pandemic, where the Center for the Advancement of Racial Equity at Work at the UCLA Labor Center did an analysis on how Black workers and the public sector were being impacted by COVID-19. And in the report, there's language that says, we must reverse Proposition 209 and include state and city funding in federal coronavirus relief packages. Of course, this was all, before. So these are very, very specific legislation, right? Proposition 209 and budget for state and city. But it doesn't count as lobbying because it was contained in this nonpartisan analysis study or research. The second exception to go into some detail about is technical assistance. This is where your organization is invited, and the invitation must be in writing on behalf of members of a committee to testify. In that testimony, you can express a view about specific legislation, and it would not count as lobbying because you were invited to give technical assistance to the legislative body. And here's the lobbying disclosures that we were talking about. So today we just focused on the 501c3 lobbying rules from the IRS. And the IRS is the only one that limits how much lobbying C3s can do at all levels of government. We did not talk about the federal lobbying rules, the state level and the local levels. As Nona mentioned, we do have fact sheets and podcast episode on the FLDA and other resources as well. So if you're looking for those, we can certainly help with that. And as a wrap up,
before you get off that slide, I think we said this, but I want to say it again, that these will only apply generally to groups who are doing a lot of advocacy in one particular jurisdiction. So if you're doing all federal advocacy on federal bills, then that's, you have staff in DC, then you might need to think about federal lobbying, the Lobbying Disclosure Act. If you are doing lots and lots of state lobbying, and it does tend to be those groups who have Sacramento staffers. That's not the actual definition, but then you might need to register as a lobbyist in the state of California. what I am definitely going to send out in the follow-up are the rules for city and county, which are a little bit broader and definitely have broader definitions of what counts as lobbying, and in some cases do reach a little bit lower in terms of the amount of activity that you have to be doing. So we'll definitely make sure we include those in the follow-up, and just so that you have a sense of like where you might need to follow up and what you might not need to worry about at this point.
And because of the times that we're living in, we should probably include the LAUSD lobbying as well. Generally, school boards are not, you know, we talked about earlier, they don't count as this, but LAUSD has a completely different set of rules for people who want to lobby in front of them. And again, it's not a limit, it's just if you meet thresholds and trigger lobbying.
If you spend $10,000 a year, right?
Yeah.
Then you have to register for LAUSD.
Yeah. But again, you know, if this feels overwhelming or becomes overwhelming, please, please know that we're a resource and we can walk you through these. We have in the past had to register ourselves as lobbyists at the county or the city level because of the things that we were doing. So both Nona and I live and breathe these rules, and sometimes we're in your position where we also have to report these things. So we do understand the complexity, but it is completely manageable, and we encourage you to reach out to us. I'm going to wrap up with some key takeaways, and then we will open it up for more questions. If anything, please know that 501c3 public charities, you can legally advocate, including lobby. The IRS is the one that limits how much lobbying C3s can do. So either under the insubstantial part test or the 501h expenditure. State law often does not limit lobbying, so that's true in California, there's no limit, but if you trigger thresholds, you may have to report with the state. So Boulder Advocacy is here to help you. We have resources. We have a whole lobbying series in our podcasts that you may find useful. We have resources. Our main resources for this is being a player and the connection. And we also, as a reminder here, have certain fact sheets and resources in Spanish. So if you're looking for something in Spanish and you don't see it, please let us know and we can see what we can do. We also have advocacy capacity tools if your organization's interested in looking at that. These are free tools for you to use, so we invite you to check that out. And we will spend the rest of our time together with questions at this point. And I'll pull up the technical assistance information for people.
That's great, thank you. So there was one question I thought I would answer now about people who want to lobby for something as a private citizen to make sure that it doesn't trigger being seen as lobbying on behalf of the organization that we work for. So the reason why we're here is because we want the organizations that you work for to lobby, and we want them to know that they can, and we want them to know that, they should report it when they're doing it, because sometimes, that's more the issue that's going to become a problem, is doing it and not reporting it. So, but of course, as nonprofit staffers or board members or volunteers, there are going to be times when we want to weigh in on something that's not part of our job. And we can totally do that. And so I think really it's just about being clear about who you are and not using organizational resources or describing yourself as representing your organization when you're doing it. So here's one that comes up in pandemic. Are you using your organization's Zoom account? And then I mean, the Zoom account itself, let's not get picky, but when you pop up, does it have your Boulder Advocacy logo behind you like Quinn does? Did it pop up and say that it's, the name of your Zoom account says your organization name when you're giving testimony in some online public meeting? That would give the implication that you were there on behalf of your organization. So try not to do that if you're there individually. And usually, when you're weighing in on something, you identify yourself in some way. So just, one of the things you can say is, if you just don't mention your organization, then for a lot of folks, there's no concern. Now, there are those of us, if Ephraim walks into a room, everybody knows that he represents California Community Foundation. So if he were doing that, he might want to say, I'm not here on behalf of the 501c3 that I work for. I'm here on my own personal capacity today. So, there's a lot of ways to do that. I think it's just being clear about that you're operating in your personal capacity and not using the resources of your organization to accomplish that. So that's a good question.
That's a really good question. And also a reminder that these rules that we covered about lobbying disclosures only apply to a C3 organization. So you don't have to follow these rules for your individual lobbying efforts. You may still trigger other reporting requirements, but what we've covered today is mainly focused on C3 public charities.
And you would only trigger other lobbying reporting requirements if you were getting paid to lobby. So,
okay, there's a question here about in other spaces where people have been told to be careful when also sharing information to community residents, because even if you're just informing them, but they decide on their own to make a comment or sign, they happen to say the name of your org, that they technically would count as lobbying on your end. It's if you were under the 501h election, this becomes a non-problem for you because you're only tracking lobbying expenses. So in this scenario that you point out, community residents are probably not getting paid by the organization. So even if they were seen as lobbying on behalf of the C3, it doesn't get tracked and reported because there's no money expense involved. If you were under the insubstantial part test, that becomes a little bit more hairy and more tricky, and likely, I guess I would need to know more information, but I would err on the side of counting it as lobbying under the insubstantial part test. What do you think, Nona?
Yeah, I think that essentially what you stated is correct for organizations that are under the default test, under the insubstantial part test. And so I think what's most important for everyone to understand is that under the default test, any kind of organized activity of anyone affiliated with your organization, whether it's your board, whether it's your program participants, whether it's your community leaders, counts as lobbying and has to be reported. So I think a lot of people feel like, oh, well, it's all volunteer. We're not paying anyone. We don't have to report something. You actually do, unless you take that step of telling the IRS, hey, we want to be under the 501h expenditure test, and then we're only going to track what we spend on lobbying. So it really goes back to highlighting how important that is to how you have to approach this question. And it's going to be different for all the organizations on here for a variety of reasons. Some of you are fiscally sponsored. So you don't control how your fiscal sponsor reports this information. They make the choice about whether to be under the H election or whether to be under the insubstantial part test. They'll report appropriately, and mainly in that case, you just need to let them know what you're doing because they're handling the reporting. but it may or may not make life more complicated for you in terms of what counts, to share that with them. But at least in that case, you know, it's them who's doing the reporting, and having to manage the lobbying limit and stuff like that. But yeah, in most cases, and this is, I wanted to come back to that. How do we know if the 501H is right for us? I think we forgot to say that we're lawyers, but we're not your lawyers, and we're not giving you legal advice today.
We did. Okay.
And so now's a good time for me to say that, because I have yet to meet an organization whose budget is under $17 million and who was not a church or other house of worship where the 501H test was not beneficial for that organization. So we really feel like it's really beneficial for almost anyone, unless you have a very large budget, and then you can hire attorneys who can help you navigate reporting under the insubstantial part test. There is a question about why there's a $17 million threshold, and I guess just to understand, that's a formula. Oh, I guess what you need to understand is there's a cap of the most that any group under the expenditure test can spend on lobbying is $1 million. And so just the way the formula works, it would be a budget of 17 million that would end up about at a lobbying limit under that expenditure test of $1 million. And then at that point, under the expenditure test, even if your budget goes up, your lobbying limit does not go up. So at that point, an organization, a larger organization, would be able to spend more under the default test. But up until that budget size, the 501H election not only makes it easier and makes less things count, but it also allows an organization to spend more, a higher percent and a higher number of its dollars on lobbying.
And that dovetailed very nicely into Efrain's comment in the chat about how CCF is an example of where it makes sense that they not take the 501H election and instead stay under the insubstantial part test, which also, by the way, if you make the 501H election, it is valid until you revoke it. So it is not something that is irreversible. If, as your organization grows and you happen to be in a happy situation where you have $17 million in exempt expenditure or more, you can undo that election and revert back to the default tests. Any other questions that people have? I see Nona answering a question about tracking templates. So anything else? All right. Well, we're approaching time, so thank you very much. If you don't have any other questions, Nona will drop in a link to the survey. And I saw that Deanna earlier had dropped in a link about our March 17th, which is going to be on what can organizations, nonprofit organizations and individuals that work for nonprofit organizations do around election year. Feel free to sign up for that, and hopefully we'll see you there again. Otherwise, I hope everybody has a great rest of your week, and thank you so much for joining us on this call.
Thanks, folks. Good luck in your advocacy. It's really great to be here, and go out and get them.
And call us or email us, whichever you prefer.